The doorbell rang at 10:47 p.m., and my instinct was clear. I should not open it. I was sitting in the living room with my phone in my hand, waiting for it to ring, because my husband had been calling me every night around that time. The house had been quiet for a while, and I had just started to relax when the sound of the bell broke that silence in a way that did not feel right. No one visits that late without a reason. The bell rang again, sharper this time, as if the person outside knew I was inside and was waiting for me to respond. I stood up and walked toward the door, not rushing, but not ignoring it either, because leaving it unanswered felt just as wrong. When I reached the door, I did not open it immediately. Instead, I looked through the glass. The moment I saw him, my body tensed. Victor was standing outside, and for a second, I stayed completely still, my hand resting on the door without moving. I had not seen him in 10 years, and I had built my life carefully in a place where I believed he could never find me. But he had, right there, in front of my house. I looked again to be sure, but there was no mistake. His face had changed slightly with time, but I recognized him immediately, and with that recognition came a feeling I thought I had left behind. I unlocked the door slightly while keeping the chain in place, leaving only a narrow space between us. Victor did not speak and simply stood there calmly, as if this meeting had been expected. That calmness made the situation worse. I was about to ask why he was there when I noticed what he was wearing, and that detail changed everything. A company uniform. For a brief moment, my mind resisted the connection, but once it formed, it was impossible to ignore. He worked for my husband. I closed the door immediately and stepped back, trying to process what that meant. A few days earlier, my husband had mentioned that someone from his company might come to collect an envelope, and at the time it had seemed like a small and unimportant detail. Now it was not. I walked to the hallway drawer, opened it, and saw the envelope exactly where I had left it. My hands were steady, but there was tension in my body that had not been there before. I picked it up and returned to the door. Victor had not moved. I opened the door slightly again and passed the envelope through the gap. Our fingers touched briefly, and I pulled my hand back immediately because the contact felt uncomfortable in a way I could not ignore. He took the envelope, but instead of leaving, he stayed where he was and looked at me more carefully. There was no anger in his expression, but there was a quiet awareness that made me feel exposed, as if he understood something I had never said. I did not speak, and I did not trust myself to say anything. The silence stretched longer than it should have, and it became uncomfortable in a way that words could not have fixed. Then he stepped back, turned, and walked away without saying anything. I closed the door immediately and locked it, checking the lock again to be sure. The house became quiet again, but the silence no longer felt the same. Something had shifted. I stood there for a moment, trying to understand what had just happened, but no clear answer came. I had left that part of my life behind years ago, or at least I believed I had, and I had built everything carefully to keep it that way. And yet, in one moment, it had returned. I went upstairs and opened my son's door. He was sleeping peacefully, unaware of everything that had just happened, and watching him brought a sense of stability that I needed in that moment. I stayed there longer than necessary, letting that calm settle my thoughts. But one realization remained clear. Victor knew where I lived, and now that he had found me once, there was no reason to believe he would not return. That thought stayed with me long after I left the room. That night, I did not sleep properly. I lay awake, listening to every small sound in the house, noticing things I would normally ignore. Even when everything was quiet, I did not feel at ease, and every passing minute made the silence feel heavier. My thoughts kept returning to the same question. How had he found me? I had never told anyone about him, not even my husband. I had chosen to leave that part of my life behind completely, believing it was better to move forward without reopening something that had already ended. But now that silence felt like a mistake. If Victor knew where I lived, then his visit was not random. It meant something. The next morning I tried to return to my normal routine. I took care of my son, prepared his meals, and moved through the house as I always did. But my attention was not fully on what I was doing. It kept shifting toward the door, toward the windows, toward any sound that did not belong. I noticed myself checking the lock more than once. I noticed myself looking outside before moving through the house. These were small actions, but they were not part of my normal routine. They were signs. Nothing happened that day, with no knock, no movement outside, and no sign that he had been there at all. But the feeling did not go away. It stayed with me, just below the surface, waiting. By evening, the house returned to its usual quiet state. My son fell asleep, and I sat alone again in the living room, holding my phone, waiting for my husband's call. Everything looked the same as the night before, but it did not feel the same. I kept thinking about the way Victor had stood there, calm, certain, as if he had not come by accident. That detail stayed with me. People do not return after 10 years without a reason, and whatever that reason was, I had not seen it yet. I looked toward the door again, even though there was no sound. That was when I understood something clearly. This was not over, and the next time he came back, it would not feel like a surprise anymore. Before I share the rest of story, I need to know, where are you listening from? I would love to hear from you. 3 nights passed before anything happened again, but the feeling from that first visit never left me completely. During the day, I tried to keep my routine unchanged, telling myself that I was overthinking the situation, yet my actions quietly showed the opposite. I checked the front door more often than before, paused near the windows without realizing it, and reacted to small sounds that I would normally ignore. By the 3rd night, the house was calm again on the surface, but that calm no longer felt trustworthy. I had just put my son to sleep and was in the bathroom when the lights suddenly went out, leaving me in complete darkness. The water from the shower continued to run, but the silence around it felt immediate and unnatural, as if something had been cut off all at once. For a brief moment, I stood still, trying to understand whether it was simply a power cut or something else, but then my attention shifted to something more important. My son was alone in his room. I turned off the water and stepped out quickly, wrapping a robe around myself without taking the time to dry properly. The air felt colder than usual against my skin, and that sharp change made everything feel more real and immediate. When I stepped into the hallway, I paused. The house was completely dark, and even the light from outside was gone, which meant the entire area had lost power. That should have made the situation feel ordinary, but it did not. The silence felt too complete, and it made every small movement more noticeable. I walked to my son's room first and opened the door carefully. He was still asleep, lying in the same position, undisturbed by the darkness around him. His breathing was slow and steady, and for a moment, that was enough to calm me. I stayed there for a few seconds longer than necessary, making sure everything was fine. Then I heard it. Then I heard a knock from downstairs, clear enough to stop me immediately. It was not loud or aggressive, but it carried a deliberate rhythm, as if the person at the door was certain I was inside and had no intention of leaving quickly. I closed my son's door quietly and stepped back into the hallway, focusing on the sound. My body had already reacted before I made any decision, and I found myself moving toward the stairs without hesitation. Each step felt measured, not because I wanted it to be slow, but because my attention was completely fixed on what I might hear next. The darkness made the house feel unfamiliar, even though I knew every part of it. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stopped. The house was silent again. Then the knock came once more, slightly firmer this time. There was no doubt anymore. Someone was at the door. I walked toward it and stood a short distance away, not touching the handle yet. For a moment, I simply listened, trying to decide what to do. Opening the door felt like a mistake, but ignoring it did not feel safe either. I leaned slightly and looked through the glass. Victor was standing outside. The darkness made his figure less clear, but there was no uncertainty in my mind. He stood in the same way as before, calm and still, as if he had been there long enough to feel comfortable. This was no longer a coincidence. I remained where I was, watching him through the glass, while he stayed completely still on the other side. The distance between us should have felt like protection, but it did not feel sufficient anymore. After a few moments, he stepped slightly closer to the door. I did not move. I did not open it. I did not speak. The silence stretched again, but this time it carried more weight, because I knew he would return even if he left. Then, without any warning, he stepped back. He turned and walked away. I stayed where I was for several seconds after he disappeared, making sure he was gone before I reached for the lock and secured the door. My hands felt colder than before. That night, I did not return to bed. Instead, I sat in the living room in the dark, listening to the silence as if it might change again at any moment. The house no longer felt like a place to relax. It felt like something I needed to watch carefully. The next night brought a different kind of tension. There was no knock. I found myself waiting for it, watching the time pass slowly, but nothing happened. The absence of sound created its own pressure because without a pattern, there was no way to predict what might happen next. Before going to bed, I checked every window and every door more carefully than usual, even though I knew they were secure. That awareness stayed with me, making it difficult to settle into any sense of normal comfort. On the following night, the pattern changed again. I was standing near the window holding my son when I noticed a slight movement outside. At first, I thought it might be nothing more than a shadow, but when I looked more closely, I saw him clearly. Victor was standing near the side of the house. He was not at the door. He was not knocking. He was simply watching. The distance between us was greater, but the feeling was stronger because his presence was no longer limited to the front door. It extended to the space around the house, and that made it impossible to ignore. I stepped back immediately and closed the curtain, holding my son closer without thinking. His presence made the situation clear in a way that nothing else had. This was no longer something I could wait out. Fear has a way of returning quietly when it is not addressed, and I recognized that pattern from my past. I understood what it could become if I allowed it to continue. So I made a decision. The next night, when the knock came again, I walked to the door without hesitation and opened it slightly, keeping the chain in place as before. Victor looked at me with a different expression this time, not surprised, but attentive, as if he had been waiting for a change. I did not step back. I did not avoid his gaze. I spoke calmly and told him to come back the following night. For a moment, he studied me, as if trying to understand what I was planning, but there was no confusion in his expression. It felt more like he was measuring the situation rather than questioning it. Then he gave a small nod. He turned and left. I closed the door and locked it, noticing that my hands were steady this time. The fear had not disappeared, but it had changed. It was no longer controlling my actions. It was pushing me to act. The next step was clear. I needed help. The following morning, I contacted my husband's office and asked to speak with the manager. I explained that one of the drivers had been coming to my house late at night and that his behavior had become concerning. I did not explain everything, but I said enough to make the situation serious. The response was immediate. They took it seriously. The manager told me he would come that night. After the call ended, I noticed a shift in myself. It was not relief, but it was something closer to control, and that alone made a difference. That evening, I followed my routine as usual. I put my son to sleep, I checked the doors, and then I waited. At exactly 11 p.m., the doorbell rang. This time, I did not hesitate. I walked to the door and opened it. Victor was standing there again, but this time, things were about to change. I stepped back as the porch lights turned on and the entire front of the house became visible. Victor's expression changed the moment he realized we were not alone. The calm control he had shown over the past nights disappeared, replaced by hesitation. His eyes shifted past me, taking in the two men walking toward the door. One of them was the office manager. The other was a police officer. The situation changed immediately. What had felt quiet and controlled until now was suddenly clear and exposed, and there was no space left for silence to carry meaning. Everything that had been unspoken was now visible. Victor straightened slightly, as if preparing to respond, but the confidence he had carried before was gone. He was no longer directing the moment. The officer spoke first, his tone steady and direct, as he asked Victor about his repeated visits to the house. There was no aggression in his voice, but there was clarity, and that clarity made the situation official. Victor tried to respond, but his words lacked the certainty he had shown before. He described his visits as harmless, but the explanation did not match the pattern of his behavior. The manager stepped forward and confirmed that there had already been concerns about him at work. Hearing that shifted the situation further because it made it clear that this was not an isolated incident. Victor's silence returned, but it no longer carried control. It showed uncertainty. The officer explained what would happen if the behavior continued, and the message was simple enough that it did not need to be repeated. There were now clear boundaries, and those boundaries removed any space for confusion. Victor looked at me once. This time I did not look away. There was no fear in that moment, only clarity. Then he turned and walked toward the street. He did not argue, and he did not try to explain himself further. His steps were quieter now, lacking the certainty he had carried before, and for the first time since he had returned, he did not feel like a presence that could reach into my life. I watched him leave without moving. For years, I had carried the memory of him as something that could affect my choices, even after I had left. But in that moment, I saw him differently, not as someone connected to my present, but as someone who no longer had a place in it. That change did not come from anything he did. It came from how I saw him. After he was gone, the officer spoke briefly to me, making sure I understood what to do if anything like this happened again. The manager apologized and assured me that the situation would be handled from their side. I listened, answered when needed, and thanked them. When they left, the house became quiet again, but this time the silence felt settled. It no longer carried tension or uncertainty. It felt complete. I closed the door and locked it, then stood there for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to recognize the difference. The fear that had followed me over the past days had not disappeared completely, but it no longer controlled how I thought or how I moved. It had lost its influence. I went upstairs and opened my son's door. He was still asleep, undisturbed, and seeing him like that reminded me that life had continued through everything that had happened. That steady presence grounded me in a way that fear never could. I stayed there briefly, then closed the door and returned to the hallway. The next evening, my husband called. His voice sounded the same as always, steady and familiar, and for a moment, I followed the same pattern, answering normally and speaking about small things. Then I paused. I knew that I could not keep this separate anymore. I told him that when he returned, I needed to talk to him about something important. He did not ask questions. He simply said he understood. That response mattered more than I expected because it gave me the space to speak without hesitation when the time came. 2 weeks later, he returned home. That evening looked like every other evening on the surface, but I knew it was different. After our son fell asleep, we sat together, and I told him everything. I told him about Victor, about the past I had never shared, about the nights he had come back, and about what had happened at the door. Saying it out loud made it feel clearer, as if something that had been distant for years had finally been placed where it belonged. When I finished, I looked at him and waited. He did not respond immediately. He took a moment, considering everything I had said, not reacting quickly, but understanding it fully. Then he reached for my hand. That simple gesture carried more meaning than any words could have. There was no judgment in it, no distance, only acceptance. In that moment, something shifted in a way I had not expected. For years, I had believed that keeping my past hidden would protect what I had built, but in reality, it had only created a space where fear could return without warning. Now that space was gone. Everything was in the open, and because of that, it no longer felt threatening. In the days that followed, life returned to its normal rhythm. The routines came back, the quiet evenings, the small, familiar moments, but they felt different, not because the situation had changed, but because I had. I was no longer carrying something unspoken. I was no longer waiting for the past to return. It already had, and I had faced it. That night, as I turned off the lights and walked upstairs, the house felt quiet again. But this time, it felt like mine. And for the first time in years, my past no longer felt like something waiting behind me. It felt finished. If this story kept you listening, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Subscribe for more emotional stories that stay with you long after they end.